So today we're going to discuss whether chainmail existed in the 10th century BCE, and we're also going to discuss whether crucifixion was practiced in ancient Egypt. Now, this does directly impact certain verses of the Qur'an. It's going to be quite interesting, it's going to be a little bit technical, and it's going to provide you with some of the tools to be able to counter historical anachronisms such as these. Stay tuned.
قرآني نبض حياتي قرآني طهر ذاتي قرآني عصمة أمري قرآني طوق نجاتي قرآني نبض حياتي قرآني طهر ذاتي قرآني عصمة أمري قرآني طوق نجاتي
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. My name is Ismail Moosa and I'm pleased to welcome you to our third episode where we're going to be refuting a series made by J. Smith wherein he tries to present historical anachronisms about the Qur'an. As we mentioned in the first episode, a historical anachronism is basically it's a claim that the Qur'an got something wrong historically. For example, J. Smith claimed that the Qur'an said there was a masjid, when Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam made the Mi'raj, but historically there was no masjid there. That was his claim. And if you want to see the answer to that, you can go to our previous videos. So in this episode, J. Smith brings what he calls historical anachronisms. He brings three of them. The third one has to do with the crucifixion and how the Quran denies the crucifixion, which is a historical fact. Now that's a separate topic. That's like a completely independent video needs to go to rebut that and to show how very weak the Christian claims are for the crucifixion. So inshallah, that will be covered in our episode 4. But in today's episode, we're going to deal with the first two of his objections, right? The first one is basically where he says that, in the Quran, it says about Dawood alayhi salam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told him أَنِعْمَ السَّابِغَاتِ وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ, right, which basically can be translated, broadly speaking, to mean fashion coats of armor and perfect the links in these coats of armor. So J. Smith says, well, you know what, there's that means that this armor was referring to chainmail, and chainmail only existed in the year 200 BC, which was 800 years after Dawood alayhi salam. So listen to this clip where J. Smith basically explains his objection.
Chapter 34 of the Quran. Let's go back to our slides, and there you'll see chapter 34, verse 10 to 11, which says this: "And we certainly gave David, and we made pliable for him iron, commanding him make full coats of mail and calculate precisely the links." Well, you can see, what is that referring to? That's chainmail, right? So obviously the question you'd ask is, did they have chainmail at the time of David, who was living about 1000 BC? No, they didn't. Why? Well, let's go back to the slides. We know that David lived there in 1000 BC. Coats of chainmail were not invented until 200 BC, 800 years later. So that's a huge problem.
Now, as you saw there, maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't notice, but J. Smith didn't provide any sources. And so, you're supposed to be an expert, so many years in the field, supposed to be a researcher, but you can't provide any references for your claim. So where's the reference for the fact that chainmail only began being produced in 200 BC? There's no reference for that. Where's the reference of the tafsirs which show that وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ refers to chainmail? You don't even have those references. So we're just supposed to trust you. So we'll use this as like our guide for forthcoming videos as well, to show what to do when a missionary or whoever it is attacking the Quran with so-called historical events. Firstly, let's see your sources, let's see your proof. You can't just say this was invented then or this was invented here and we must just believe we need to see sources. And in the case of J. Smith, yes, we've played an excerpt, but you can go through the whole video. There are no sources mentioned, which is already discredits the video right from the start. But now let's look at this sort of historical claim. So assuming there were good sources, and if you do a quick Google search, you can see that chainmail began to exist or in the year like in the 3rd century BC, which is around the 200s BC, right? So what does this mean when historians tell us that chainmail first began to be used in the 200s. What it means is this is the first time in the historical record that we have discovered usage, or we have found documents which document the usage of chainmail. It doesn't mean chainmail only began to exist then. Rather, as time will pass, historians might find another group of people who used chainmail before that. And as the historical record gets bigger, the archaeological record gets bigger, you'll find more groups of people who used it earlier on and earlier on and earlier on. And this happens constantly in the historical record. As we discover new pieces of evidence, we realize that, okay, wait, we thought that perhaps the Iron Age only started here, but it looks like no, in certain places it started before that. So when people make the claim that, chainmail only began to exist in the 200s BCE, what they're actually saying is, from the current historical record that we have, from all of the archaeological evidence and the writings that we have, which is only a fraction of what really existed. Most of the writings of history are completely lost. From the fraction we have, the earliest record we do have is in the year 200 BC, if we're taking Jay's claim. They're not saying that before 200 BC there wasn't any chainmail. They're saying this is the first time on record that we have this, right? So that's something to think about. Now, if we're going to apply this sort of reasoning, well, they didn't find it, therefore it doesn't exist. So this is the claim of the missionary when it comes to historical anachronisms or historical errors, so to speak, that absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Now that's false. Absence of evidence does not mean, this is not evidence that of absence, that something wasn't there. So the fact that you haven't found chainmail dating back to that time doesn't mean that this is evidence that chainmail didn't exist then. So, using that, we can discredit most of the Bible, because there's no archaeological evidence or historical records of Yusuf alayhi salam, Ibrahim alayhi salam. There's no archaeological records of them. Even if you look at the Exodus, which we're going to look at now, archaeology tells us that the way the Exodus is described in the Bible is completely false. There's no records of it whatsoever. So by J. Smith's logic, those events then didn't happen or historically inaccurate. Now, as you can see, obviously we as Muslims don't actually believe that. It's a really wayward line of thinking, right? But more fundamentally, he's saying that the verse refers to chainmail, وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ. Let's translate this verse literally, right? Let's see what this verse actually means. So, وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ. Sard means, and you will see on the screen here an excerpt from the tafsir literature, it means to take parts and join them together. So the verse is talking about any sort of armor which is made up of different parts, which could be links like in chainmail. So what is chainmail? Chainmail, you can see a picture here on the screen, is a type of armor consisting of small metal rings linked together in a pattern to form a mesh, right? So وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ could refer to that. But وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ could refer to many earlier types of armor. For example, scale armor, which is an early form of armor consisting of many individual small armor scales of various shapes attached to each other and to a backing of cloth or leather in overlapping rows. You can see a picture of that on the screen. Now, these were in use as early as the 14th century BCE, 400 years before Dawood alayhi salam. These were in use at that time. And so when J. Smith just, this is called bait and switch tactics. So we've seen a few tactics. Number one, no sources. Number two, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Number three, bait and switch, or just pulling the wool over your eyes, telling you Sard has to refer to chainmail. It doesn't. Chainmail is a specific type of armor. وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ is a broad term which can refer to any different type of armor which were made up of different parts, which could include scale armor, which existed well before Dawood alayhi salam. But the last point I want to make on this topic is, think about this, right? Let's look at the Quranic verse. The Quranic verse is telling you about the miracles which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Dawood alayhi salam. It's saying, وَلَقَدْ آتَيْنَا دَاوُودَ مِنَّا فَضْلًا. We gave Dawood alayhi salam many bounties from our side. يَا جِبَالُ أَوِّبِي مَعَهُ وَالطَّيْرِ. We told the mountains to echo with him when he would praise Allah, and the birds to do so as well. وَأَلَنَّا لَهُ الْحَدِيدِ. We made iron soft for him. And then it says, أَنِعْمَ السَّابِغَاتِ وَقَدِّرْ فِي السَّرْدِ. So this is talking about a miraculous event, something that was unique to Dawood alayhi salam, that other people at the time didn't have. So you would actually expect for people not to be able to make the exact quality of armor that Dawood alayhi salam made. I mean, J. Smith's not going to go and say, well, we don't have the historical record of mountains and birds echoing for the dhikr of anyone, therefore the story is not true. Of course, that doesn't make sense. It's not going to be on the historical record. This was specific for Dawood alayhi salam. So, in all points, when we look at it from any aspect, this is a really, really weak objection. Now, let's go on to objection number 2. So, this objection is about the term crucifixion, salb, coming from Sad, Lam, Ba, which is used in the Qur'an to describe punishments at the time of Moosa alayhi salam, who lived in the 14th century BC, and to describe a punishment at the time of Yusuf alayhi salam, who was in the 7th century BC, approximately, right? So let's listen to the objection as explained by J. Smith.
So you've seen at the time of Moses, who lived in 1400 BC, that there was crucifixion, quite normal there. The sorcerers affair were not able to keep up with Moses, and so therefore they were sent to be crucified. If you go even another chapter, that's chapter 12, verse 41. Here you go back to the time of Joseph. Now we're going to 1800 BC. So we're going even further back, another 400 years earlier. And it says, O two companions of the prison, as for one of you, he will pour out wine for his lord to drink. And as for the other, he will be crucified. So at the time of Joseph, when he's there in prison in Egypt, the guy that is in prison with him is going to be crucified. Crucifixions that are happening there in 1800 BC and in 1400 BC. Let's look at the slide again. You see there's some problems with this. Why? Well, we know that Moses lived in 1447. Joseph lived in around 1800 BC. Crucifixions were not even used in Egypt at all to begin with. That's the first problem. It's the wrong country. But they were first introduced in 500 BC. And you can
by
see,
the Romans.
Actually by the Lydians, who then the Romans took it from.
Yeah.
And then you can understand that the Quran's crucifixions are in the wrong place. They're over 1,000 to 1,300 years too early.
Okay, so you heard that. Now let's apply the 3 criteria which we basically distilled in the previous objection to apply to this objection. So J. Smith is saying, well, crucifixion only began to be used by the Persians and then it was transferred to the Romans and this and that, right? So number 1, where's your sources? There's no sources, right? I mean, this is just, it's just silly at this stage. I mean, you making this massive series, you're trying to show mistakes in the Quran, you don't have one source. That's just crazy, right? Now, the second one, what's the second point we said, is that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So the fact that you don't have in your historical record, which is very sparse, you don't have any records of crucifixion before the Persians were in around 500 BC, doesn't mean it didn't exist before then, you just don't have records of it, right? We don't have records going 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 BC, there's no records, virtually no records. So does that mean people didn't exist then? People didn't eat and sleep then because we don't have historical records of them? Of course not. So the fact that he doesn't have historical evidence, well, he thinks he doesn't have historical evidence of crucifixion in the 17th century BCE in Egypt, doesn't mean it wasn't there. It just means he doesn't have the evidence, right? But let's go into the more technical answer where we show that the entire claim, doesn't make sense at all. So what is crucifixion? Many people don't know what crucifixion really is. They have a vague idea, something to do with a cross, this, that, right? But as we understand it today, it means to nail or tie someone to a wooden pole or cross. So you nail the person there, or you just tie him there and you leave him there to die because his body has to support his weight. He's tied, let's say his shoulders or his arms are nailed and he's tied there like that, or he's nailed there like that. It's difficult for the body to continuously support itself, and over time you lose the ability to breathe and then you die from asphyxiation. So this is what crucifixion broadly refers to. And you can see here on the screen there's a list of Bible dictionaries defining what crucifixion means. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that there's a literal cross there or that it's exactly how Jesus did it or the Romans. No, it simply has to do with taking a wooden pole, nailing a person to it, tying him to it, or even, as you can see in the references here, impaling the person on this wooden pole. And when we look at the word that's used in the Qur'an, salb, right, you can see here, this is from the tafsir of Ibn Ashur, where he explains that salb simply means to attach or affix a person to a wooden pole, And then he says, according to his understanding of many Mufassirun, that in this context where it's used, which is not the context of Yusuf alayhi salam, it means to then kill the person by shooting them. Some other people also feel that crucifixion, and this you find that it's a punishment that the Jews were used to. After you kill the person, you crucify him by impaling him on a stake or tying him to a wooden pole to show his body to everyone. So Salb here, even when we go to Lisanul Mizan, we see that it has nothing to do with a person going on a literal cross. It simply has to do with a stake and a person being affixed to it, whether by impaling or whether by attaching or whether by tying or nailing or whatever you want to talk about, right? Now, it's clearly proven that the Egyptians would impale people, and it's very interesting when you read the Qur'an. You see Fir'aun is described as Dhul Awtad, the one who would impale, is one translation you can give, which some Mufassirin have given. And when we look at the historical record of the Egyptians, so here on the screen I've just got a slide showing the different kingdoms and the different, so you get for example here the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom was from around the 20th century BCE to the 17th century. Then you got the second intermediate stage. So when we look at the historical record, we find, and here you can see again on the screen, an example from the hieroglyphics, and this is talking about in the second intermediate period, which would have been at the time of Yusuf alayhi salam or just after that. You can see the hieroglyphics, which obviously I don't have the ability to read, but the translation is there. It says the comrade was put on the stake. So you can see that this understanding of putting someone on a stake was well known in Egyptian times, and there's many other examples like that. I just cited one of those examples that you can find in the historical record. But you want to know what's the best part of this whole thing? That in the Bible, the same story of Yusuf alayhi salam, where he's in prison, two people come, they saw a dream, and they want to know the interpretation of the dream. This same story comes in the Bible, obviously with differences and errors in the Bible, but when it comes in the Bible, you find that Yusuf alayhi salam, in the Qur'an, he says, فَيُصْلَبُ فَتَأْكُلُ الطَّيْرُ مِنْ رَأْسِ. This person will be crucified, meaning, like impaled or killed on a wooden stake, and birds will eat from his head. You see that in the Bible, the same thing is mentioned. So here's Genesis chapter number 40, verse 29. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body. But read other translations. Pharaoh will hang you, and I've got a few translations here. Pharaoh will hang you. And this is what most translations are saying. Now, according to J. Smith's logic, hanging as a punishment was only started, 5th century, 4th century BC. Do a quick Google search, you'll see that. So according to J. Smith, this verse in the Bible is wrong or historically anachronistic as well. Of course it's not. This was a broad term that was used, whether it's in the Hebrew or the Greek when we're talking about the New Testament, or the Arabic, to refer to impaling someone or attaching them to something outstanding like a tree, so that the people could see what became of them. And so you can see that J. Smith is basically shooting himself in the foot. He doesn't understand that even the same objection, the same thinking that he's using for the Qur'an is going to apply for the Bible as well. So that's it for our two objections, and now we just got a bonus segment, as we said we will have, historical anachronism number 3 in the Bible. So this has to do with the Exodus. What's the Exodus? It's when the children of Israel, Moosa alayhi salam leads them across the Red Sea from Egypt into the Sinai Peninsula, and then with the intention of going to the Promised Land. So in the Bible, when we read about the Exodus, we read that Yusuf alayhi salam, Yaqub alayhi salam, they came, about 70 people came. 430 years later, when Moosa alayhi salam is going back now, trying to go back to Canaan, going to the Sinai Peninsula, the Bible says that there are 600,000 fighting men, excluding women and children, which would mean that the Israelites were 1.5 million people, whereas 430 years later there were only 70 people. So already, it's not making sense internally. But then archaeologically it becomes problematic for so many reasons. For example, if you had a line of about 2 million people going across the Red Sea, the first half will be on that side, and the second, the beginning of the line would be in the Sinai Peninsula, and the end would still be in Egypt. It wouldn't even make sense. There's no trace of 2 million people wandering in the Sinai Peninsula and things like that. Of course, as we said, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but this is not the only evidence that we're using. When you're reading the Bible as well, you see that when Pharaoh wanted to kill the newborn males so that he could kill Moosa alayhi salam, he only told 2 midwives to go about and look for newborn males. Whereas if there was a population of, let's say, 600,000 women, you need more than 2 midwives. So the Quran corrects this whole story. This what story? The story of a large number of people making the exodus, close to 2 million. It's so historically improbable that most people have sought to interpret it in some way or the other. So the Quran corrects this here. When Fir'aun is chasing the children of Israel, listen to the words that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses. He quotes Fir'aun as saying, Inna ha'ula'i la shirzimatun qalilun. These people who we are chasing, they a very, very small and insignificant bunch compared to us. Right? And this fits perfectly with what we would know in the historical record, because the population of Egypt at that time, and this is something you can just quickly go and Google search, the population of Egypt during the New Kingdom period, you'll find it was anywhere from 3 million to 5 million. So how could there have been 2 million Israelites living there if there were only 3 million people there? It doesn't make sense from any angle. So take this example, share it with your Christian friends, and Jazakallah khairan for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي. آيات الله حمتني غمرتني بالبركات، تحفظني من همزات الشيطان ومن زلاتي. آيات الله حمتني غمرتني بالبركات، تحفظني من همزات الشيطان ومن زلاتي. قرآني نبض حياتي، قرآني طهر ذاتي، قرآني عصمة أمري، قرآني طوق نجاتي.